Okay.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Interpreter Foundation Scripture Roundtable. We are very enthusiastically presenting tonight's lesson, which is in the Book of Mormon, which is the enthusiastic part because who doesn't love the Book of Mormon? We're very excited and hope you will be too. Tonight we're doing lesson number 2 in the Gospel Doctrine Manual for the Book of Mormon. I'm Cassandra Hedelius, moderating this evening. With me are 3 gentlemen, Bruce Webster and Craig Foster and Martin Tanner. Thank you all very much for joining us. Before we get started, I just want to say that we have a lot to go over tonight. We're going over 1 Nephi chapters 1 through 7. And we might not get into every nook and cranny. There is so much that is so great. So please go to mormoninterpreter.com. That is our main web articles there. There are a lot of great articles about the Book of Mormon, and especially for the start of the year, these first few lessons, articles about mapping Book of Mormon locations and talking about just the cultural and the historical setting. There's some really good stuff, so I would definitely encourage you to go to mormoninterpreter.com and look around. That said, let's get started. So we are starting in very beginning, I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, and actually even before we get to that, Bruce, you had some preliminaries you wanted to discuss, so let's hear that.
A couple of things. First, we have to appreciate the miracle that the Book of Mormon is in terms of that it is permeated by a ancient Middle East setting, and this is something that Hugh Nibley was really the pioneer on with Lehi in the desert back in the early 50s, so 60 years ago. But just about every Book of Mormon scholar since then has extended and expanded that. This is not a book that Joseph Smith could have simply dictated, could have made it from scratch. The level of detail, the level of authenticity, the accuracy of the setting for the initial chapters of the book are remarkable. You know, there are any number of scholars who have spent time traveling along the path, and I know Craig has some things to say about that. But this is a profoundly complex and rich book. It warrants repeated study and careful reading, and you know, we could, to be honest, we could talk for several hours on these first 7 chapters. It would be very easy. But the thing to note right off the bat, the fact that this is a real record. You have Nephi's own introduction, the book of Nephi, his reign and ministry, and then a detailed description. Now this was actually based on Royal Skousen's Critical Text Book of Mormon project. This is actually on the plates. Nephi set this up before he started writing, and he started writing this 30 years after they left Jerusalem. So he's doing this for a specific intent. He gives what he thinks is going to be the table of contents, and what you'll find is he does follow that sequence of events, but there are some things that he adds in along the way, and other things that he really never gets into, such as his reign and ministry. So with that said, I will punch back to Cassandra.
All right, thank you. Now, Martin, let's go to you. You had some thoughts about kind of the background here, what First Nephi is, what part of the plates, how the 116 pages fit in.
When we picture Joseph Smith translating the Book of Mormon, many times we think of him sitting down with Emma, who is his very first scribe after Martin Harris did a teeny tiny bit, and starting out at First Nephi and working his way through the Book of Mormon, sort of discounting the whole idea of the lost 116 pages. Now, we know where the lost 116 pages ended, and that would have been where our current Book of Mosiah starts now. And the way that we know that is because in the manuscript, it's changed from chapter 3, with 3 little Roman numeral marks, to the book of Mosiah. And so presumably this was the third chapter of the initial translation process. And then what happened, at least according to the best theory, although there are several theories about where Joseph Smith went from there, but with the manuscripts that we have now, it makes sense that Joseph Smith and the scribes continued through from Mosiah, as we have it now, to the end of the Book of Mormon, and then translated starting at the beginning of First Nephi, where we're at today, and then wound up at the end of Mosiah. There are others that think that he went back and started again with First Nephi, but at any rate, this is the part of the plates that were lost, or part of the manuscript that was lost as the 116 pages, and those ended up through the Book of Mosiah. So 116 pages of translated work comprised, approximately, because that was the lost portion, 145 pages of what we have printed today. So that was a pretty good chunk of work that was originally lost. And a couple of quick follow-ups on what Bruce was mentioning, that this really fits into the Middle East context. One of the things that Nibley points out is that in 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 4, we have this statement about many prophets showing up and talking about how Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Now, I don't know about you, but if there were a lot of prophets in general conference or otherwise running around saying, you're going to be destroyed, it would be a pretty depressing time. That would be a really difficult time. And one of the things that we know now from the Lachish letters, which were 30,000 approximately clay tablets that were discovered in the little town of Lachish, is that Joseph Smith's narrative that we find here at the beginning of the Book of Mormon precisely fits what those Lachish letters describe as going on in that greater area at the time. They say everyone was depressed. It was a really difficult time. There were prophets running around foretelling of horrible things. And so you have this, I like Dan Peterson. He once wrote this piece called Joseph Smith's Greatest Hits, which of course had nothing to do with music. And this is one of those great hits. How could Joseph Smith, this young kid in upstate New York, know that letters, Lachish letters, which had yet to be discovered for well over 100 years, would say exactly what he was describing here in the first few verses of the Book of Mormon? Answer, he absolutely would not, unless this really is what it purports to be, which is something that truly came from God. And one other quick point that I'll make is that some people are often puzzled by chapter 1, verse 2, where it says, the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. And of course, we now have examples of Hebrew writing in Egyptian because it was shorter. And I remember seeing that when the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit hit BYU and then later came to Salt Lake City. But that fact was not lost on me when many years ago now, I was called on a mission and went to Japan. And it struck me after finally learning something about the language that Japanese would be a modern example of this. Their characters are all borrowed from the Chinese system of writing. And so if somebody were going to write a book in Japanese, they could say that I'm writing something and my parents have told me about it, and I'm doing it in the language of the Japanese, that the characters from the Chinese language, which would be the equivalent kind of thing here. It's the knowledge of one system, the Japanese perhaps, and the writing system of another culture entirely, which would be the Chinese. And here the Egyptians And the Jews did that very same kind of thing, which seems counterintuitive and has been the force of much ridicule. And here again we have Joseph Smith doing something that he could not possibly have known about that is exactly right on and verified by modern archaeology and scholarship.
Yep, and because shorter is exactly what you would want the writing to be when you were writing on a medium that would cause worse than hand cramps and actually engraving into soft metal plates. Shorter the better. Yeah. Thank you very much, Martin. All right, and let's talk a little bit more about background here too. We have the handy-dandy little guides on the bottom of the pages as you go through the Book of Mormon telling you about years. We're starting out in about 600 BC, give or take 597, something like that, 600 BC. So 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 4, we know that we are in the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah. And then we are talking about Jerusalem, but not necessarily Jerusalem as a discrete city as we think of it today. You'll notice the language that Lehi dwelt at Jerusalem in all his days. And Craig, could you please enlighten us as to the significance of that language? Craig, you are sorry. I might have said Craig and meant Martin. One of you. Go for it if you don't want to.
I think Martin would actually be the better one,
Okay.
although I've heard the same argument, but I think Martin would do a better job of explaining it.
Okay, Martin, please.
I would be happy to do that. People for a long time ridiculed the idea that Jerusalem was a place and not just a city. The Book of Mormon here talks about in 1 Nephi chapter 3 verse 10 and a few other places talks about how the land of Jerusalem and not just the city of Jerusalem. And people said, Joseph Smith, he's so dumb, he didn't even know that Jerusalem was just a city and not a land. And it turns out that Joseph Smith was right. Jerusalem is not just a city, but it is also a prefecture, or what we in the United States might call a county. Just like in Utah, we have Salt Lake City, which is within Salt Lake County, and you can find hundreds of examples of this all across the country and in other locations in the world. Jerusalem was both a county as well as a city, so the idea that they were in the land of Jerusalem, not just in the city of Jerusalem, makes perfect sense and fits right in with the culture of the time and is not an anomaly.
Very much. And then also, I'm not an expert on this, but we do have archaeological evidence, documentary evidence, that the setting here is correct. Zedekiah was the king. Later in the Book of Mormon, it talks about his son Mulek, which is less well documented, but there are indications that there was a son named Mulek too. And so overall, 1 Nephi chapter 1, chapter 2, we have a situation where a family in Jerusalem, they are faithful, and the rest of Jerusalem is not doing so well spiritually, and so they are called to leave the city before it is destroyed, which is a familiar pattern to anybody who reads the Bible. I don't know, let's see, we've kind of covered some of the details about chapter 1. Are there any more thoughts about that before we move on, Bruce or Craig?
Yeah, let me make a few comments. First, it's good to keep in mind as you're going through this that Nephi starts writing this 30 years after leaving Jerusalem. And after he and those who followed him have split from Laman and Lemuel, actually fled for their lives, more or less, and have established themselves in the land of Nephi, and are building their temple. And when Nephi splits and leaves, he takes with him the brass plates, the ball or director, and the sword of Laban, and builds a temple So in essence, he's asserting himself as both the temporal and spiritual heir of Lehi. And when you read the Book of Mormon, basically starting from 1 Nephi chapter 1 through 2 Nephi chapter 5, what you'll see is Nephi building the case as to why he is the rightful heir. And he does it first by establishing Lehi's bona fides. It's very interesting. He actually, in describing what his father goes through, he draws upon images of 3 different prophets. Jeremiah, obviously, because Jeremiah was out there preaching in the streets as well, but also the ascension type vision from Enoch and Moses leading those in the wilderness. Any number of scholars have shown how deliberately Nephi drew upon Mosaic themes and Exodus themes in writing this. And as you go through these chapters, what you'll see is, in essence, Nephi setting out, here's the choices I had, and I chose to obey my father, I chose to obey the Lord. And you start to see Nephi to become identified more and more with Lehi, culminating in him saying about the commandments that God gave Lehi and me, my father and me. Whereas Laman and Lemuel, you see themselves distancing themselves more, and with whatever brief periods of repentance or sullen obedience they have, they're always drifting back again. So Nephi is writing this with a point, and this is going to show up as we get later into the Book of Mormon, because hundreds of years later, when you've got the sons of Mosiah preaching to the Lamanites, you'll have the Lamanites saying, you guys are thieves. You stole things from us. You stole the birthright from us. They're still 400 or 500 years later, still very angry over what Nephi took when he left. And the thing that always, when they are converted enough to repent, what happens is that you have, whether it's Alma, whether it's Sons of Mosiah, whoever's preaching will go out and set forth basically the history that's laid forth from Nephi and say, this is what actually happened. And that's an important part of the conversion of those among the Lamanites who joined the Nephites, is learning that information. I think it's one of the reasons why we read in Alma that the Nephite dissenters hardly ever converted back, because they already knew the story. They already knew, the actual history that happened. But the Lamanites had an entirely different, version of this, and when they heard the version and heard so with softened hearts, they said, oh, that makes sense. That's really what happened. So, going through these chapters, keep in mind that Nephi is establishing his bona fides. He's setting himself up, and I don't mean this in any negative way, but he's basically saying, here are the choices, here are the decisions. Here's where I made the right choice, here's where my brothers made the wrong choice. And you're going to see that again and again and again, all the way through 2 Nephi 5, where at which point you have Nephi's famous Psalm of Nephi, where his heart is just broken over how the family has divided, and he tells no more history after that. Everything after 2 Nephi 5 is all prophecy and preaching. So just keep that in mind as we read through these chapters.
Very good thoughts. And I'm thinking, too, that I guess there are some counterexamples in the Bible, like Jacob got the birthright over Esau. But this account is a little bit, a little bit breaks the mold that this is a society and a culture that places a lot of importance on order of birth. If you're firstborn, then you have the right to lead the family, the right to rule the later descendants who are born. Laman and Lemuel had a point that, according to tradition and culture, they should have been in charge, and yet here's Nephi saying that he is in charge not by virtue of when he was born, and not according to the cultural scripts that they're all very familiar with, but instead because he is favored by the Lord. He makes the right spiritual choices. He is able to access the power of the Lord to help to guide them. I don't really know what point I'm making about that, but it is.
Well, no,
Well-
it's a good point, because Nephi goes on. There's a few points where Nephi basically says, "Guys, you're the older brothers. You're the ones who's supposed to be providing leadership. It shouldn't be up to me, your younger brother, to tell you what's right and wrong." Which, of course, just endears him to his brothers. But
Yeah. Well, and also if you look at the account of Jacob and Esau, you can see where Jacob is basically justifying why he was the one to basically receive, geez, my mind went blank, but to receive the blessings and to
Birthright.
be the heir, the birthright. Thank you. So in a way, you can kind of see the same explanation there. Nephi is explaining and showing why he was the one who was to lead, because he was following God, and the same with Jacob. Well, it's a messier story with Jacob and Esau, but you know what I mean there. I was going to say another thing, and I can't remember. So I'll be quiet.
Okay. Did anybody else have thoughts about that before we move on to another topic? Okay, then Craig, I'm going to bring it back to you, actually. You had some thoughts about the geography here. Lehi, the Lehi colony, as they're called sometimes, they haven't made it very far yet. They're just outside Jerusalem. But what do we know about where eventually they head?
Well, I'm going to mention, I think it was really interesting, and before we started recording, we had really a great discussion, which I only have one small portion of that, so hopefully Bruce will make some comments, and Martin will too. But there's so much out there in the way of literature that has, where people have researched, they've analyzed. There have been Latter-day Saint historians and others who have gone over to Israel and into what is now Saudi Arabia to try to track and follow the trail of where Lehi and his family might have gone and how they might have traveled. And I had commented before we got started about a book which was written by George Potter and Richard Wellington, titled Lehi in the Wilderness, where they I think set out really very good arguments as to where the valley of Lemuel and the river of Laman might be located, and how Lehi and his family might have traveled through the wilderness to get there. But there's also other books. I know that Grant Gardner has written some wonderful books on this, and I might add there's articles on Interpreter that discuss various aspects of the Book of Mormon. So I'm just going to encourage people to look at Hugh Nibley, because Bruce brought up what Hugh Nibley wrote, and I remember as a teenager reading that and just being blown away. And I continue to be impressed with the scholarship that has come out, not only on Book of Mormon geography, but to other aspects of studying the Book of Mormon. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce or anyone else.
Well, let me jump in. And here's a simple thing for those of you listening to this. Just go to Google and type in Lehi's Trail and look at the images. And what you'll find that while there are some disputes over where Bountiful is exactly and where the value of Lemuel is exactly, here's the truth. The Book of Mormon describes exactly the only course that can get you from Jerusalem down the Red Sea and then turning eastward and ending up in Bountiful. And it turns eastward at exactly the right spot, which is Nahum, which is attested by altars to have existed there in the 7th century BC. And I am highly amused when I see Book of Mormon critics try to explain this all away. There's a long-standing joke among LDS scholars, particularly Book of Mormon scholars. I heard it all the way back when I was an undergrad at BYU. It was like either Wilford Griggs or Kent Brown. He said he wanted to write a paper called Joseph Smith in the British Museum, The Lost Years. It's the extent that these critics will go to try and somehow explain how Joseph Smith got this precisely right. He talks about following the borders down, and there's an actual big trail. It's pretty much the only way you could get down the coast of Saudi Arabia there is what's described in the Book of Mormon. And Nahum is exactly the point where you have to turn east and take the trail due east. If you turned any sooner, you'd end up in the empty quarter, which looks a lot like Tatooine out of Star Wars, just open desert. And taking that trail eastward, you end up right near the coast. And if you turn and head for the coast, there are at least 3 good solid candidates for Bountiful that are these very lush, for what you would expect in the Middle East, very lush coastal enclaves that exist in exactly the spot where Joseph Smith, or the Book of Mormon describes they should be. And without going too far, I have little respect for most Book of Mormon critics, because I find what they do is they really do strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. They find some small thing to criticize. Oh, well, this is here, and therefore this can't be true. And they don't explain the other 99.9% of the Book of Mormon. And so, I'll say what, one of the things I said beforehand. I have written for a living before. In my case, it was technical writing for computer magazines, books on computers, and so on. But I've published 150 articles. I've published 4 books. I've contributed to 2 others. I have written probably 24 expert reports and lawsuits and so on. I actually made my living as a writer for a time. I could not have written the Book of Mormon. To try and create something like that would be a work of years. Trust me, I have like 3 or 4 novels that I'm working on, and I have a terrible time trying to keep chronology, characters, and everything else straight. It's very difficult. The historical record attests to the vast majority of the Book of Mormon being dictated in a period of 90 days. And the comment, which again, better LDS scholars have made, is that, any explanation for the Book of Mormon other than Joseph Smith doing an inspired translation of an ancient record is frankly less credible, and that's precisely my feeling as well.
Thank you, Bruce. I don't want to make this contentiously bagging on Book of Mormon critics hour, but we'll just say I absolutely agree with Bruce that these criticisms don't really hold up if you really study the Book of Mormon. It is far too complex for most of their little things to carry any weight, and most of the little things have over the years proven to not even be worthy of continuing as little things. However, if you are a teacher and you are teaching Book of Mormon to your Gospel Doctrine class, it is very possible that some of your class or even yourself might run into some criticisms of the Book of Mormon that do sound really reasonable and really persuasive. If that happens, don't flip out. Don't worry. There are lots of resources to help you. You can leave a comment, roundtable at Mormon Interpreter. You can send in a question at fairmormon.org. There are lots of very knowledgeable people who can give you great answers there. You can just search around the Interpreter website, the Fair Mormon website, the LDS.org website. There are resources. Just keep looking, reach out when you need help, and you will find it. I promise you, there are good answers. There really, really, really are. Okay, any more thoughts on geography before we move on? From Martin is the only one who hasn't weighed in. Martin, do you want to talk about geography?
Very briefly, and that is that in addition to the book that Craig mentioned. There's a book that's been around for quite some time that comes to basically the same conclusions. Lynn and Hope Hilton wrote a book probably 20 years ago or so now, In Search of Lehi's Trail, and they have exquisite pictures and great details in there. But in terms of overall Book of Mormon geography, probably, in my personal private opinion, the single best source is still one of the earliest ones, which is an ancient American setting for the Book of Mormon by Professor Sorensen of BYU. And John Sorensen's book, An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, just lays out all of the different options, and it goes to the text itself to come up with the best plausible locations for the Book of Mormon. And I know there are many other possible locations, but John Sorensen is reserved. He's not going to say, this is where it is. He will say this is the most plausible location. But those are good resources to start with. Back to you, Cassandra.
Great, thank you. All right, let's move forward to chapter 3 and talk about an important concept in these first few verses. All right, so they are out in the wilderness. They've already left their home, left their property, and then suddenly they get these instructions to go back. Verse 2, Lehi is saying to Nephi, "Behold, I have dreamed a dream, in the which the Lord has commanded me that thou and thy brethren shall return to Jerusalem. For behold, Laban hath the record of the Jews, and also a genealogy of my forefathers, and they are engraven upon plates of brass. Wherefore the Lord hath commanded me that thou and thy brothers should go unto the house of Laban and seek the records, and bring them down hither into the wilderness." And then there's some important doctrine that comes right after that. We'll save that for a minute later. But right now, let's talk about this concept. And there is some accompanying verses in the book of Mosiah that talk about this too. Mosiah chapter 1 verses 3 through 7, just how important it was for them to have these records. Why the brass plates? And it gives a hint of it here that they need the genealogy of their forefathers, the record of the Jews. So I think the record of the Jews is talking in part about the Scripture. The brass plates included parts of what we now know as the Old Testament, and then also the genealogy. And then when we go to those verses in Mosiah that I mentioned, hang on and I will turn there. Mosiah chapter 1, starting in verse 3, that if not for those plates which contain those commandments, we must have suffered in ignorance, not knowing the mysteries of God. Going down into verse 4, it also brings in the concept of language, that without, let's see, having been taught in the language of the Egyptians, therefore he could read these engravings and teach them to his children, thereby they could teach them to their children. So talking about how important it is to have those commandments, to know about the mysteries of God, to be able to have those written down in language that they understood. Okay, so having read through all of that, who would like to talk about this? Why is it important to have records and to bring scriptures with us?
Well, I'd like to mention one thing that I'm sure Bruce and Martin can do a much better job with the scriptures part, but I'm going to, if it's okay, I'd like to just make a few comments about.
You do a marvelous job. Go for it.
About genealogy itself, because genealogy is really important. I have a quote really quickly by Alex Haley, who of course wrote Roots. He says, "In all of us there is a hunger, marrow deep, to know our heritage, to know who we are and where we have come from. Without this enriching knowledge, there is a hollow yearning. No matter what our attainments in life, there is still a vacuum, an emptiness, and the most disquieting loneliness." And I just want to just expound on that for just a moment. several times in the scriptures, in both chapter 3 and then in 5, it talks about, he said that the brass plates contain the genealogy of my father. In chapter 5, verse 14, that he also found upon the plates of brass a genealogy of his fathers. Wherefore, he knew he was a descendant of Joseph. And then also in verse 16, Lehi did discover the genealogy of his fathers. It is really important that we know who we are, and we know where we came from, because one of the worst things that can happen is to lose that connection, that foundation. All of us need to have a feeling of self-worth, a feeling of having roots somewhere. All you have to do is look into history to see when people's genealogy has systematically been stolen from them, using the Cultural Revolution in China as an example. Believe it or not, the Family History Library in Salt Lake has the largest collection of Chinese clan genealogies in the world. And the reason why is because there was a systematic destruction of the genealogies in China. And why did they do that? Because they didn't want them to have that connection to the past, that connection to their foundations. And I think we're going to talk about the scriptural aspects, and obviously that was very important to have the commandments of God and the teachings that were on the brass plates. But I think a very important thing was that they needed to have their genealogy. That just the comment here that Lehi, wherefore he knew he was a descendant of Joseph. Just the fact that he had to read that to kind of reassure him. Obviously, it had the genealogy of who begot who, etc., and so forth. But and he would have been aware of the fact that he came from the, which tribe he came from, that he came from Manasseh, that he came from Joseph. But to have that written down, to be able to verify that, helped him realize who he was and who they were. And this was something that could continue to be taught. And you look at the people of Mulek who did not have that, and what a difference it made. So this is kind of my little thing to encourage everyone, all of the members of the church. You have got to know your genealogy. It's not just something pretty that you can put up on the wall, or you go and do the temple work and then you forget all about who you're related to. There's a reason why Heavenly Father wants us to know our genealogy. To know who we are and where we come from, and that ultimately we are children of God. Okay.
Thank you very much, Craig. I would like to add my feelings to that. I agree with Craig 100%, and just think about just today, this modern world in which we live is very focused on the here and now, and on this idea that you need to be authentic, you need to be your true self. But what that generally ends up meaning is to be your natural self, to give the carnal man free reign and free expression in shaping your character and your destiny. And I think that if the people in the world could get a sense of what Craig is talking about, that they are rooted in a heritage, in a tradition of all these people, their family who came before, that it would help to counteract that, help people to see that they're part of something larger, that it's not just about the here and now and eat, drink, and be merry and die, but that there are people who lived and loved and worked and sacrificed to make possible the things that we have now, and that they, in a lot of cases, were extraordinary people. They underwent immense hardships and suffering and proved themselves through immense trials. Sorry, cat again. And that means something. When I read through the biographies that I have several autobiographies of great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, it's almost hard to explain what those mean to me. These weren't prominent people. That's nobody that any of you have ever heard from and heard of unless you are cousins of mine. And yet they were remarkable people. Just reading about the day-to-day details of their lives and how hard they worked and what they were working for. They were trying so hard to get ahead against incredible odds. They weren't rich. They didn't have anything handed to them. It makes me feel I'm ashamed in a way of how good I've got it, but then also inspired to make them proud, to do what I can with what I have to contribute to this wonderful tradition that they started, to make myself a person of great character the way that they did. So yes, I agree 100% with Craig. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, just as an additional thought, and we'll get into this in later lessons. Lehi's party found people waiting for them there when they arrived in the New World. They don't directly state it, but the circumstantial evidence from the text itself is very clear, and frankly, the archaeological evidence, particularly with the Mesoamerican setting, is very clear. Lacking, and to the point of that both Craig and Cassandra have made, lacking these brass plates, they would have vanished like a drop in the ocean. They would have assimilated, and that's, there might have been some legends passed down, again, as per the example I think Craig made of the Mulekites. That would have been at best. With these tangible plates, if you stop and think about it, brass plates, this is the only thing that could have survived a trip across the desert, across the ocean, and the Central American jungles. I served a mission in Central America. It's hot, it's humid. Anything short of those brass plates would have been destroyed one way or another along the way. These were preserved. The language was preserved. You had this family language that was passed down from generation to generation to read the plates, and it very much became this is who we are, this is where we came from. So the plates survived. They kept their identity, at least the small core familiar group, kept their identity as descendants of Joseph, as of Israel, and with the coming Messiah. Now there's some other interesting things. The brass plates were almost certainly a northern kingdom Israel version of the Old Testament. There are prophets that are quoted there that we don't have. Personally, I have my own suspicions that their book of Deuteronomy may have been much more simplified than what we have in the current New Testament, because these plates were almost certainly created before the Josiah reform that preceded Lehi by about 30 years before the start of the Book of Mormon. So you actually have more prophecies and more direct prophecies of the Messiah, and you've got this anchor that you've got this nucleus culture that, even with all the culture that's surrounding them and the other cultures that are there, they're managed to hold on to their identity for 1,000 years because of these plates. And to get back to the point that both Cassandra and Craig have made, we in the church sometimes sort of mock the old pioneer heritage thing and so on. I'm a convert to the church. I joined at 14, only member of my family. I have no pioneers, no Mormon pioneers in my lineage or anything like that. But those stories mean a lot to me. If anything, the older I get, the more I appreciate the day in, day out sacrifices that kept Mormonism alive in Utah through the second half of the 19th century. There were some times there where it could have simply got extinguished, and there were just constant sacrifices that kept it going. The brass plates were that seed crystal, that nucleus. There were multiple restorations. We tend to think of the Nephite history as being this one unbroken chain. If you read the book more carefully, there were apostasies and restorations, and where things had to be reestablished. Some were reformations, some were honest goodness restorations. But these plates keep getting handed down, and they're the things that keep that thread going for 1,000 years. And this is the reason why Nephi went back, and why we haven't even talked about it yet. He ends up killing Laban for them. The Lord's comment is quite literal. It is better that one man should perish than a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. And I don't think we always appreciate. There would be no Book of Mormon. The Nephi, even if they made it all the way to the New World, they would have vanished. We would have no idea of what had happened there without those brass plates. Those were essential to what the Lord wanted to happen.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Yeah, amen to all of that. Man, and you are right that we always get like 75% of the way through these, and I realize we've only done about 40% of the scriptures that we're assigned to do. But we can't leave chapter 3 just yet until we talk about the verse on which the most popular primary song is based in, which is the scripture mastery verse, that Lehi tells the boys, go back to Jerusalem, get the plates, and Laman and Lemuel murmur, saying, it is a hard thing which I have required of them. This is chapter 3, verse 5. And Lehi responds, behold, I have not required it of them. This isn't just Lehi's whim, but it is a commandment of the Lord, that Lehi had a dream, where the Lord told him that they need these plates. It's a commandment of the Lord. Therefore, go, my son, and thou shalt be favored of the Lord, because thou hast not murmured. Another important lesson there, that Laman and Lemuel, they did all the things. You write out a list of the accomplishments of Laman and Lemuel, and it's pretty impressive. They went into the wilderness. They went on this exodus. They went to the New World. They went back to Jerusalem. They got the plates. They got Ishmael. The problem is they just whined about it the whole time, and that makes a big difference. And then in verse 7, it came to pass that I, Nephi, said unto my father, which the Lord hath commanded, for I know that the Lord giveth no commandments unto the children of men, save he shall prepare a way for them, that they may accomplish the thing which he commandeth them. And there's a reason why that primary song is so popular, because we all need this lesson in our heads and in our hearts all the time, that there's never any reason to despair or to whine or to get uppity about the things that we are asked to do, commanded to do, and encouraged to do. It is possible. With the Lord's help, all things are possible. Otherwise, he wouldn't have asked us to do it. Any thoughts about that? Nope. Okay, great. Let's move on. We are going to, let's see, most of the rest of chapter 3 we have covered more or less, the concepts at least, if not the narrative. Be obedient. Don't whine. Go do the things that you are supposed to do and not murmur. If you see an angel who tells you that you're on the right track, go and fulfill these commandments and don't be mean to your brother. Angel departs. Don't do verse 31 in chapter 3, which is to start to murmur again, saying, this really isn't possible. I think that's a lesson about how we can do all the right things, but the condition of our hearts really, really does matter, and that's a matter of our choice. What do we really want? What do we really value? And if we are having doubts, having trouble believing, I think the first question should always be, do you want it to be true? What is the condition of your heart? Do you value the fruits of the gospel that it has brought you and your family? That's a good first step. All right, so moving then into chapter 4, we have the narrative that we're not going to be able to do justice to, that Nephi and his brothers go in, they try and buy the plates from Laban with their shiny property. Laban keeps the shiny things and sends them away, and then they, first they ask, then they try to buy it, and then finally Nephi is forced to kill Laban for the reasons that Bruce explained to us, that it really was that important. That's a hard saying, but it really was that important that they have those brass plates before they left to make their new home. Bruce, did you have something to say?
It's interesting. Hugh Nibley tells a story. Not long after he started teaching at BYU, he was asked to teach a Book of Mormon class. Book of Mormon was required for any student who went to BYU. And they had a special class. There were a bunch of Arab students who came from wealthy families from the Middle East who were probably looking for a relatively safe school to send their sons to. And he was teaching Book of Mormon, and he got into chapter 4 here. And as he described it, he said he's feeling very uncomfortable, because here's Nephi, he's supposed to be this hero, killing a defenseless Laban and so on. And he said as he was teaching, he noticed the Arab students sort of muttering to each other and getting more and more agitated. And he thought, oh gosh, they're just going to totally reject this. He said finally one of them raised their hand and said, I have a question. Said, why did he wait so long? And their attitude was Nephi said just picked up the sword and killed Laban as soon as he found him, instead of having these prolonged justifications and arguments with the Spirit and everything else. And Nibley says this was sort of his impetus to say, oh my gosh, there is a Middle East context for the Book of Mormon that I haven't considered. And I think this pretty much led to his first Book of Mormon work, which is Lehi in the Desert, which talks about that and talks about just how well the Book of Mormon captures aspects of nomadic Arabic life. And having read one of the works that Nibley cites in there is 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence, which is a stunning book. I've read it before. It's the sort of book where I sort of want to quote a chapter to someone or quote a paragraph to someone, and the next paragraph I want to quote that one too. But he talks about the nomadic Arabic culture and how much it fits, particularly Laman and Lemuel, and their sullenness and their dragging and sudden threats and then backing down and so on and so forth. But we tend to, here in early 21st century, we tend to impose our own perspectives on the Book of Mormon and on what people are doing there. And I think one of the reasons why the analysis has been done over the past 60 years by LDS scholars for both the Middle East setting and for as Martin mentioned, the Mesoamerican setting, really, which is the closest thing to a consensus as far as where the New World portion of the Book of Mormon took, is so critical, because you read the Book of Mormon differently when you realize these were real people, 2,600 years ago, doing things in a way that made sense in their culture, and a lot of stuff that early critics of the Book of Mormon howled about has turned out, as per some of the comments that have been made so far, has turned out to be some of the best bullseyes. Right back to the Land of Jerusalem thing, or Martin's talk about the Lachish letters. You get as more stuff has come out, it's like, my gosh, this fits into the setting so well. A classic thing is, Nephi, when he gets to New World, builds a temple, and that was a howler when the Book of Mormon came out. No Jew would build a temple anywhere but Jerusalem. And of course, 100 years later, they discovered that the Jews at Elephantine in Egypt had built a temple. And so, this is something to keep in mind as you are teaching the Book of Mormon, as you're going through this narrative. This is a very different culture. This is a very different time. Yes, there are standards of morality that are timeless and are universal, and we see that in the Book of Mormon. But to understand what we're reading in the narrative and the interactions between the people and choices we make, it helps to understand the setting, the time, and the place that it's taking place.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking there are depths beyond depths here. You can't understand or describe an entire culture, an entire civilization, really, over hundreds of years, multiple civilizations on multiple continents, over hundreds of years. That's not an easy thing or the work of an afternoon, and definitely not the work of a few Google searches. But that's okay. If you are teaching and you have questions, just do what you can. Look up a little bit of background if that seems like a important thing that you are led by the Spirit to do. The most important lessons of the Book of Mormon are spiritual. It is the testimony of Christ, but this context can also, as Bruce said, really help people to understand what they're reading and the people that they're reading about. And they had thought processes. They're not just characters on a page. And the more that people study, the more people realize about that. Okay, any more thoughts on chapter 4, Laban, Zoram, the brass plates, before we leave that? Nope. Okay.
I'll throw in one more point here, because
Okay, go for it.
This is a theme you'll see throughout the Book of Mormon. This is the taking of oaths, and again, this is another bullseye with the Middle Eastern culture, is how seriously they take the oaths. When Nephi, calls out to his brothers, and Zoram suddenly realizes, uh-oh, this isn't Laban after all, and is ready to run back into the city, and Nephi realizes they can't do this. If they let him go, they're going to lose. They'll either have to kill him or they'll do this. And Nephi wrestles him to the ground and says, "As I live and as the Lord liveth." Now, those are the two most solemn oaths you can give in a Middle Eastern context. You're taking an oath on your life and on God's life. And what's Zoram's reaction? Said, "Okay." And he turns around and goes with them. Doesn't even go home to pack. Just like, "Okay, I'll go with you." I think at this point, part of Zoram's thought may be along the lines of, I'm in big trouble anyway if they find out Laban's dead and the plates are missing. So this may actually be a safer solution for me. But as you read the Book of Mormon, look for when people say, "As the Lord liveth," or "As I live," or see where oaths are taken. You will see this crop up all through the history of the Book of Mormon. And what you will find is that with a few rare exceptions, people on both sides, including among the Lamanites, will keep their oaths. In fact, you'll see this happening with Zarahemnah when he leads the Lamanites against and battles Alma and is conquered. And Alma says, "I want you to take an oath that you're not going to come back." And Zarahemnah says, "I'll give you my weapons, but I'm not going to take an oath I won't keep." And they start fighting again. And finally Zarahemnah says, look, okay, I'll take the oath. And he departs, and you never hear about Zarahemnah again. He never comes back. The oaths were taken very seriously. And again, this is something that Joseph Smith would have no concept is. Joseph famously turned to Emma very concerned and said, "Did Jerusalem have walls?" In these chapters, he was very concerned because he's translating and is talking about the walls of Jerusalem, and he's sort of panicked, like, did Jerusalem have walls? I didn't know that, and of course it did. But it's keep an eye on that, and there is a larger context, because what you will see is what is a way of life in keeping oaths. You're going to see that sort of transform, particularly in a time of King Benjamin, King Mosiah, and Alma the Elder, and to a certain extent Alma the Younger, where it's now oaths to God, where they're entering into covenants. The concept of an oath between two people becomes a concept of a covenant between you and God. And that those need to be taken very seriously.
Great, thank you. While you were talking, it was... Oh, sorry, just really quick, I was going to say, it was reminding me about... I just recently read an account and analysis about Laban and Zoram and Nephi, this whole event that happened, and how well it fits into what we know about the history of that time and the politics or the power struggles going on among the powers in Jerusalem, and it explains so well some of these details that we just take for granted that that's how the story goes. But I don't think it's published publicly on the web, but if it is, I will find it and I will link it. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Martin.
I was just going to piggyback on what Bruce said. Nephi himself utters the same kind of an oath in 1 Nephi chapter 3, verse 15, where he says, he's talking to Laman and Lemuel, who are reluctant to go back, and he says, "As the Lord liveth, and as we live, we will not go down unto our father in the wilderness until we have accomplished the thing which the Lord has commanded us." So here's Nephi himself giving the same kind of an oath that Bruce describes. And as I've gone through the first couple of chapters here, I won't take time to get the references, but I've circled, probably a little more than a dozen examples of oaths, and those are the kinds of things that, as Bruce points out, those were frowned upon in the early 1800s and even today in our culture. That's not something Joseph Smith would have put in.
Great, thank you. We are going to not do justice to chapter 5. I think the main concept is, again, harkening back to chapter 3, how happy they were to have the brass plates. And the boys brought the plates back to Lehi and Sariah, who were, of course, very glad that they were still alive and back. And so chapter 5, verse 14, Lehi found the genealogy of his fathers. He knew that he was a descendant of Joseph. So again, just this joy, knowing who they are, feeling connected to this land and this culture and this family that they were going to leave, and that connection gave them, I think, maybe the strength and the confidence that they needed to go forward to the new promised land and plant themselves in that new setting and carry on the work of their fathers, their lineage as being of the house of Israel. They were descendants of Joseph, the son of Jacob, and how important that was to them. And then also it mentions the kind of the original, I think of it as the original pioneer story, the Exodus, that the children of Israel were led out of captivity in Egypt, verse 15, by that same God who had preserved them. And I just love how that motif gets repeated over and over again in history, in Scripture, recounting the history that you have the children of Israel being led out of Egypt, and then and that's very important. It comes up multiple times. Nephi refers to it as they're being led in the same way, and then later in the Book of Mormon you have kind of the Nephites' own pioneer story when Alma and his group are preserved by the Lord as they escape from King Noah and his priests. And then that's referred back to later in the Book of Mormon. And so when we revere our pioneer stories, as Bruce was talking about, we are in very good company. It's very important, and you're on solid spiritual ground to be doing that. People throughout the Book of Mormon did. It helps to, I think it's spiritually important just to remember how merciful the Lord has been, as it's put later on in Moroni, and those stories help us to remember that. We're not going to do justice to chapter 6 either, really, to any of this. Chapter 6 talks a little bit about Nephi writing writing the genealogy, or no, he's not going to give the genealogy of his fathers in these plates. Suffices me to say that we are descendants of Joseph. It's just a little bit of an insight into Nephi's thought process as he decides what to write, what not to write, what his constraints are in terms of time and space on the plates, and but he will, so verse 6, he will give commandment to those coming after him that they will not occupy these plates with things which are not of worth unto the children of men. Okay. Thoughts on that before we go to chapter 7?
Actually, it's Nephi actually gets a bit confusing when he's talking about his plate, so it's a bit challenging to parse it through here. But as I said, Nephi seems to be doing this split where his large plates are sort of an echo of the Hebrew Bible has basically 3 divisions. It's got the Torah, the books of Moses. You've got the prophets, which are the writings, the historical writings of the prophets, and actually the history of Israel itself. And then you have the writings, which are sort of Daniel and Psalms and Proverbs and Job, and these books that they're heroic stories, or it's ascension literature or apocalyptic literature, and so on and so forth. Nephi almost seems to be doing the same division. His large plates are going to be historical. His father's writings are on there, so they're very much prophetic in that sense. And then he's got this second set of plates, which is sort of his personal autobiography, his history, explaining why he's doing what he's doing. Like I said, he ends up taking that up through about 40 years after they leave Jerusalem, at which point he gives no more historical stuff. He spends most of his time quoting Isaiah, quoting his brother Jacob, and giving his own apocalyptic prophecies for the end days. And I think that may have been a deliberate echoing on her part. In other words, having left the land of Israel with the brass plates, he feels this obligation to continue both the prophets section and the writing section. And he's doing this with the records that will be kept through the 1,000-year history of the Nephites.
Very cool. Thank you. All right, let's move on to chapter 7. We have the original original departure of Lehi and his family from Jerusalem out into the wilderness. Then Lehi has a dream saying, "Send your sons back to go get the brass plates." And then they come back out into the wilderness. And then Lehi again receives the commandment of the Lord. The Lord spake unto him again, saying, "Send the boys back to go get Ishmael and his family." So this isn't a very efficient way of getting them out into the wilderness and everything that they need, but I suspect maybe it had to do with just emphasizing the importance of it, that, all right, great, you obeyed, you got out of Jerusalem, so you're not going to be destroyed, but before you take off completely, you really, really need scriptures. Go back and get those. Those are worth going back for. And then you really, really need families. So go back and get wives. Those are worth going back for. So Ishmael. Let's talk about Ishmael. I forget, who was it that had some insight into who is Ishmael?
Well, Ishmael, the Semitic tradition, as we actually see in the Old Testament, you have a lot of uncles marrying nieces or first cousins marrying. Ishmael was also of descendant of Joseph. There's a good chance that Ishmael and Lehi were relatively closely related, because you have Laman and Lemuel and Nephi and Sam go up and say, "Hey, come with us into the wilderness. We're going to a promised land." You figure, most people around Jerusalem at that point would basically say, "You're nuts. We're staying right here." Instead, they pack up and go. And I think there's two reasons behind that. One is that Lehi was family. I think Ishmael knew about Lehi's prophesying, probably believed it, but hadn't gotten up the courage to do anything about it and hadn't any direction himself. Second, and we often overlook this in the Book of Mormon, Babylonians have already come in once. Babylonians came in, sacked Jerusalem. They're the ones who put Zedekiah on the throne. He's their puppet king. So they've already come in once and sacked things, and Zedekiah is on the throne, and I suspect for a lot of people living in the kingdom of Judah, they saw the handwriting on the wall. It's like, well, Babylonians can come back at any time.
And that's part of what I was talking about before with the details of Laban and Zoram. Why was Laban going out at night in his armor to a secret meeting? Yeah. Okay,
so
sorry,
it was very complex. Anyway, so the fact that Ishmael comes without much problem, but what you have is they get halfway back, and frankly, Laman and Lemuel are up to their little tricks, and a couple of the sons of Ishmael are all like, wait, this is nuts. We're going back. People of Jerusalem are fine. We believe them. We believe the current. We think things are going to be fine under Zedekiah. Babylonians have already come and gone. And once again, it's up to Lehi. It's not Ishmael, which doesn't speak. Ishmael was probably pretty old at this point. And the fact that he dies later on is probably an indication. Nephi, it's up to Nephi to say, no, we need to go, and once again, they they're going to tie up Nephi and leave him in the wilderness and head back, and he gets free, and then they're going to kill him again. But one of the daughters of Ishmael, who's probably the one who had her eye on Nephi, and the wife of Ishmael and one of Ishmael's son plead for him. And Nibley points out in Lehi in the desert that, you know, among the very volatile and violent nomadic Arab culture, it is never embarrassing to back down to the pleas of a woman. You know, if it's the pleas of a man, you know, if it's man telling you to do, you're going to go right up to the edge and so on. But if a woman says, "Oh, please don't do this," then you can gracefully say, "Oh, okay, for you, I'll change my mind," which is what we have happen here. And they ask for forgiveness, and they head back down. One other note: both here in chapter 7 and in chapter 5 chapter 5 after they come back with the plates, it says Lehi offers sacrifice and burnt offerings. And Kent Brown I think was the first one to point out a number of years ago. Sacrifice is for thanks. Burnt offerings is for sin. That's for forgiveness. His speculation is the burnt offerings after the first trip was because Nephi killed Laban. And even if he's instructed by the Lord, it's like, you know, we have to do a burnt offering to ask the Lord for forgiveness for taking his life. In this case, I suspect it's because you have Laman and Lemuel tying up Nephi and, in effect, being willing to leave him to die in the desert, laying hands on him. And once again, Lehi, you have this sense of collective guilt as a camp, and Lehi is offering sacrifice for the thanks for everyone coming down, and burnt offerings for the sins that were committed in the process of bringing them down. I'm sorry, I'm talking.
Please do not be sorry. Yeah, the only thought that I had while you were talking is that I have fond hopes and expectation that in some future millennial or maybe celestial day, historians will be able to interview and think through history and write out all of this from the women's perspective involved. That will be pretty awesome. Okay, last call for thoughts before we wrap it up. Craig or Martin? Nope. Okay. Then we are going to wrap it up. Apologies, as always, for the parts that we skimmed over quickly, but hopefully, actually, definitely, this gave you quite a lot of background to go on. And I think Bruce is the one who said before that we really could talk about this for days. I wish we could. Thank you all very much for joining us, whoever and wherever you are. This has been the Scripture Roundtable discussion for lesson number 2, Gospel Doctrine, Book of Mormon. So excited to be talking about the Book of Mormon right now. Please look for other great roundtables and articles and blog posts at mormoninterpreter.com. Feel free to leave comments, suggestions, etc. there. And we will see you next time. Goodbye, everybody.